lovely to see you, Sarah, and welcome. Thank you very much for accepting to be one of my interviewees on this exciting series for B4. And just to tell our listeners, to remind them, the series is called Challenges of Leadership During the Pandemic. And Sarah Foster is managing partner of the Oxford office of Freeths. She's been in this position for 7 years, and so was extremely young when she took the position. This is one of the large practices, legal practices in Oxford, and I'm delighted that Sarah is here with me today on a Monday morning in the middle of one of our 2 lockdowns. So Sarah, and for our listeners, I should say a little bit about who I am, because you may not know me. I'm Alison Haill, CEO of Oxford Professional Consulting and an executive business coach working with large companies in the UK and worldwide. So Sarah, first question for you is a nice easy one, because this is not a test. It's what challenges have you personally observed? No, actually, let's start with what challenges have you actually experienced during the pandemic in leadership?
Well, thank you, Alison, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak this morning, Monday morning. I think if I reflect back on the last 10 months of lockdown, one of the biggest challenges which I think I have faced is just that certainly at the beginning of lockdown, it's quite difficult whenever there's a change, and people generally don't like change. But normally, what I've normally found is that so long as you explain things to people and they understand why there has to be a change and what the goal is, and particularly the time period during which this change is going to take place, by which time you're going to get to your goal, they tend to come with you on it, and it all, you can work together as part of a team. But obviously, the pandemic was a change which I think none of us really envisaged or anticipated, and it did mean in those early days, I think it was very difficult for everybody, because we didn't really understand why there had to be the change, how long it was going to last for, or indeed what the goal was to be. Although obviously part of the goal was, let's try and stop COVID in its tracks, and let's get back to some sense of normality. But obviously it was all very difficult. So I think the knock-on effect of all of that did impact on people's morale, positivity, and may I also say just general happiness. I really felt that normally, and certainly myself, I'm a really quite a positive person, and always see the best in things, and want to achieve the best goals, etc. But I think everyone found it very difficult, no matter how positive you normally are. And I felt that was a real challenge in terms of just making sure that people were as positive as they possibly could be during the lockdown, particularly. I think another challenge which I found was one of our firm's values is all about answers, not options. And it's trying to provide clarity and certainty for people. And obviously, during this pandemic, there has been so much uncertainty. No one's really been sure what's going to happen next. There's been all sorts of, it's been like a roundabout, and uphills and downhills, and you never knew where you were going with things. So I think for me personally, I found that quite difficult in terms of just providing people with a semblance of certainty and normality when really there hasn't been one. So I think that's been difficult too.
Yes. Oh, so that's very interesting then. So when you talk about the happiness of your whole team and your own optimism, would you say the challenge has been both keeping other people happy as well as feeling optimistic yourself?
Yeah, I think, I'm not immune to that. As I say, I'm normally a really positive person, but I think personally, there have been times when I've thought, perhaps we've just made a decision to do a certain thing, and then through circumstances completely outside of our control, we've had to change tack. I know we're not alone in that as a business. You know, there've been all sorts of different curveballs thrown at us, and so I think sometimes it's been quite difficult to think, right, okay, we've made that decision, but oh crikey, something else has happened now, which means we're going to have to think about it again and come to a different decision. And sometimes, you know, that does make you think, oh, not again. And I think if I was feeling that as a leader, then for my team as well in Oxford, I do, as I say, like to give clear answers, but sometimes, you know, that it's had to change and it's had to be a lot more fluid than it is normally. I mean, the amount of times I've gone through the office rota and talked to people about whether they wanted to go into the office, whether they didn't want to go into the office, what the rules were, what the rules weren't. You know, I would be a rich person if I had £1 for every time I thought about it, certainly. So I think that's been difficult.
Yes, yes. And if we have time at the end, I have got a few questions that I'd like to ask you. If we have time at the end, I'd quite like to ask you about changing tack, because that's that can be a bit of a minefield for leadership. Okay. Yeah. My second question is, what differences have you observed in others in their leadership during this strange period rather than normally?
I mean, I think some of the examples I've seen where perhaps leadership styles have changed a bit is I've noticed that there seems to be a lot more consultation and communication with staff. I mean, certainly, I mean, at our firm, we're pretty good at that anyway, but I think, you know, we have very much for example, our staff council normally meets once a quarter, whereas during this pandemic, we've been meeting certainly every sort of 3 weeks, something like that. So, you know, much more sort of consultation than with people than perhaps there is in the past. But I think, pardon?
That sounds very positive.
Yeah, because I think it's just been recognised that, you know, we haven't all got the answers, and for us as leaders, as I say, we do our best, which we always would do, but I think the more that you can consult with people who you work with, and people can feel that they're part of a team, deciding on some of these issues that we're dealing with, then that's the better for us as leaders, but also it's the better for our team too. So I think we certainly have done more of that, but just sort of looking around outside of our firm, I think for all leaders, they perhaps have learnt to a greater extent that it's not such a bad thing sometimes to show that you haven't got all of the answers, and you're trying to weigh up various things before you reach a decision on something that you want to do.
Yes, I think that's very, very, very true. Okay, now I did want to ask you a little bit about the difference between the first lockdown and the second one, because I think you've noticed some clear differences in many things.
Yeah, well, yes, Alison, because I think in the first lockdown, of course, it happened so quickly that, you know, one day we were all in the office and the next day we were all working from home. To an extent, perhaps we're not doing so much in the second lockdown, but in the first one, you know, some of our people were working from home for the first ever time. They hadn't done it previously, and we were all at home. And I think, you know, in that first lockdown, even though obviously that was a change and it had been forced on us, in a way it was, dare I say it was quite exciting because it was new and it was novel, and we were all trying to get used to that. We were all sort of communicating through these sorts of channels, which, you know, I'd never heard of Zoom before. You know, and I felt certainly in those early days, you know, there were all sorts of things that were happening when you were communicating like this with people at home. So you saw people's families, you know, children, pets, you know, and it was all sort of interesting. And I felt actually it was a benefit for me getting to know some of my people actually in their home lives in a way that you never ever do when you're in the office, when you hear about children but perhaps you haven't met them. So in those sort of early days, yes, it was all very challenging and it was difficult and it was all a change, but part of it was, oh, it's new and how are we going to deal with this? So, you know, you would do, and also you have to remember those early days, actually the sun was shining and, you know, and we all got out, we all got to see nature and experience the outside and the grass and everything else.
Yeah.
Whereas then we got to the second lockdown. And I think that people thought, not this again. You know, we'd done it once, we'd got through it, we'd had a glimpse of you know, the outside world again, and we'd seen our colleagues, and then we were put back into lockdown again, and it wasn't new.
So
You
how
know,
does the leadership have to change then in the second time?
well, I think it had to change again quite markedly, because we were faced with that, of everyone feeling really, I think, quite down when we went into that second lockdown, and especially because with the first one we naively all thought it was only going to be for a few weeks. I remember, you know, maybe we'll be out of this by Easter and then, you know, we'll all be back. Whereas this time I think everyone just recognized, and I remember the Prime Minister talking about March, you know, it's all going to be very difficult right through to March of next year. And I think just psychologically for people, just thinking of that stretching ahead through those dark winter months, it was really quite negative. And I think people were thinking, crikey, how are we going to get through this? So I think we have had to change again in terms of our leadership style. I mean, I'm talking to people, I'm always talking to people anyway, but even more so than I ever did. We're trying to think of new ways that we can engage with our teams. Because, you know, in the first lockdown, we all got really excited about how we could have, say, quizzes through the Zoom lines. But I think people now are sort of getting a bit tired of Zoom and quizzes, and they're wanting to do different things. So we're trying to think about different ways that we can do things with our team, and a different leadership style that we have to take too.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yes, I think it's very interesting to look at how things are different. And also, I think quite a lot of us, or quite a lot of you probably, because I work from home a lot of the time, quite a lot of you were thinking, oh, how lovely not to have to do that commute.
Yes.
Soon,
Yeah.
soon that pleasure dissipated a bit.
Yeah, no, well, that's very true, because you know, obviously the first time I think we all loved the fact that we could be at home and avoiding the commute, whereas I now know a lot of people, myself included, now think, oh, I wish I could just get in the car and drive somewhere, you know, and because that was my sort of time when I used to drive to and from the office, and getting that distinction between work and home, I think people find
Yes,
difficult.
yes. Okay, now you had a specific work strategic challenge that you've been that's been occupying your leadership mind during this period. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I've it's been occupying quite a lot of my thoughts currently is just in relation to what the workplace is going to look like post COVID. So during the last few months, as a firm, we've introduced a new Agile working policy, basically recognising that even post COVID, we probably will never go back to how we used to work. And basically giving people the flexibility to really choose how much they want to work at home, how much they want to work in the office. And for me, that's just raised a number of challenges in terms of thinking about the office of the future and how it's going to have to look, what is it going to have to provide that you don't get from home to pull people back into the office, because you know, I do see lots of benefits and advantages of working from home, but likewise, I think there certainly is a place for the office in the future, for collaboration, to see your colleagues, you know, to make sure that you're discussing things in a way that perhaps you don't do from home. And also particularly, I think, for junior members of staff, I think it's very important for them to learn from more experienced people by way of osmosis, etc., through being in the office. And I think, you know, sometimes you lose some of that. So I've really been grappling with, what does an office look like in the future? And just from sort of conversations I've had already with people, it's really interesting to me how people have different wants and needs depending upon what sort of a personality they are. So from one extreme, I've had someone say to me, I never want to go back to an office now, Sarah. If all I'm going to do is just sit at a computer and answer my emails and write my reports, that's not what I want. To the other extreme, someone else said to me, I just need to be back in that office, Sarah. I really dislike working from home and I want to be back there full time, as I always did in the past. And just making sure that we are accommodating all of those different wishes and needs, and just making sure that it is that sort of vibrant place that I think it's going to have to be to pull people back in the future.
Yes, yes. And it will be interesting in a future conversation perhaps to discuss how different it is for the, you know, the experience for your clients, your lead clients, whether they can actually come in and speak to you across a table, and does that actually make a difference to them? I imagine it's a personality thing as well.
Yeah.
My last question, because we're nearing the end of our time here, is I think you have a pretty collaborative leadership style, but I have a particular continuum that I like to ask on this survey. If we think of a continuum from transparency at one end and certainty to the other, which is a rather unique continuum, I grant you, where would you say your leadership style is between those two?
I'm probably going to plump, you're not going to be surprised when I say this, probably about halfway along it. Albeit that I think naturally my style tends to be pretty transparent. I'm pretty open, tend to wear my heart on my sleeve, which I always think, you know, is no bad thing. But so, you know, probably of that, probably edge more towards the transparency, but I do very much the leader. I quite often I work on my gut feel. And I do recognize that people need certainty and they don't like to see their leaders saying, well, I don't know what to do. What do you think? I do tend to have a bit of an idea about where I think we should be going with things before then consulting. But I always think it's so much better if you can then discuss and explore your ideas with your team before, just making sure that then everyone's with you as you move forwards. So yeah, so I'd probably say about 50-50, but probably lean a bit more towards the transparency, open side, I think.
Yes. So just a final thing, because I think we've got a minute, on changing tack. What's your view as a leader on changing tack? Does it show weakness or does it show strength? And what's your thinking about that?
Oh, I think it really shows strength. I think you're a foolish leader if you're not prepared to be flexible and adapt to changing circumstances. I mean, I think particularly in during this pandemic, I think everyone has recognised that there is so much outside of our control that, you know, things are just happening without something that we've done or haven't done. And I think you'd be a fool if you didn't then react to that and take that into account in terms of your decision making process.
Yes, yes. Well, I agree with you, actually. So,
Good.
good. Well, thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. And that was very helpful and very nice to have a female leader in this series. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to talk about the difference between female and male leadership, but we can do that in our next series. Thanks so much, Sarah. Bye bye.
Thank you, Alison. Good chatting. Bye.